Decentralized identity. This is a topic and a space where there are a substantial number of players. We have seen a lot of people such as Sam Altman producing products in this space. The Decentralized Identity Foundation is headed by Kim Hamilton Duffy, who is joining us on the show today. Very excited to have you on the show. Kim, can you tell us a little bit about the Decentralized Identity Foundation, your role, and what you're hoping to accomplish?
Thank you. Yes. Hi, it's great to be here. DIF is an engineering focused organization, and we're focused on developing standards, tech, and prototypes that give people more agency and control over their digital identity and identity data. So this aligns with principles from decentralized identity, or how it's often called self-sovereign identity, or SSI. And recently that increasingly extends to identities that of their devices, software, and even AI agents interacting on their behalf. So SSI, decentralized identity standards, and tech work for all of these and allow them to compose well. I am the executive director at DIF, and again, it's great to be here.
And we're also joined by Ken Griggs. Ken, you are the CEO of Julia.Social. I know that there's already been some buzz about the company. You've started to make some waves out there in the world of X and more broadly. Can you give us a quick introduction to Julia.Social and tell us how you play into decentralized identity?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we have, when this airs, we will have just launched the Julia.Social's first product, which is called NotBot. NotBot is not only a decentralized identity method, but it is also an anonymous proof of human. So just think of it's literally what it sounds like, NotBot. How do you prove you're not a bot? And I'm really excited to get it out there. I'm really excited to see the response, and I'm really happy to be here.
So decentralized identity, if we just start thinking about this at its core, it's different from identity that we've traditionally had. Identity, when most of us think about this, think about a passport or a driver's license or some other type of identity for which a centralized authority is creating it on our behalf or issuing it. And then we use that identity, but we do so in a very centralized way. You have to go back and talk to that centralized authority to say, is it valid? Checking its attributes, it has an expiry, all of that kind of stuff happens very centrally. And there is a way to validate it, but oftentimes that validation comes through some sort of checks against the document itself, or you're potentially even calling back to ask the issuer if that thing is valid. In the case of digital centralized identity, I'm thinking about things like Facebook and Google, where those things have to be online and actively participated in cutting you some kind of a token or giving you something. Decentralized identity is something different. And I think when I think about decentralization, I often think it's got to be some sort of a form of blockchain, but that might not necessarily be the case for some forms. Am I getting it right, Kim? Is this what we think about when we think about centralized versus decentralized? And what are some of the critical aspects of why decentralized identity is important versus having a centralized identity?
That's right. There is that aspect of needing to be online. And, I think you mentioned some of the different examples along the spectrum of, so there might be your government identity, but then there's also digital identity that you get through participation in social networks and email. And it's sort of a fluke of the sort of Web 2 evolution that this digital identity is so siloed into service providers. The idea that, as we've seen increasingly over the last few years, social networks come and go. And so much of that, your network, your reputation is tied into a single one. And there's the risk of deplatforming for sure. But then there's also the fragmentation that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, as happens with centralized. And I'll just add how I got into this space about 9 years ago was the idea that So we were working on a project at Learning Machine called Block Certs with MIT Media Lab, and we were trying to address the problem of longevity of education and skills credentials, course completions, things like that. So how do you continue to prove it's about you? And it's sort of this this unfortunate thing that a lot of times relying parties or verifiers, or wherever you're applying to, are trying to use your skill credentials. They don't necessarily have a lot of confidence in it, because they're wondering, well, how do I know this is even you? How do I know it's about you? The issuer may not be available. They might go out of business. And so there are all kinds of challenges around that. And that's really how we sort of, through specific use cases of longevity of education and skills claims, got into the need, urgent need for decentralized identity. And so I think that that's one that I like to keep front and center in how I think about the needs, because those, especially in the US, we have education providers that go out of business, and sometimes that sounds really foreign. But when you think about this whole, your whole learning educational skills background, if you can't sort of prove anything about it, that becomes very risky.
So blockchain seemed like a natural fit for half of what needs to be done here: durability, provability, decentralization. Is it necessary that something like a blockchain exists to really pull this off? Or is that just one of the ways that you've seen companies or identity providers attempting to do a decentralized identity system?
It's one of the ways. And I think over time, so when we started with block certs, we were aware that we didn't want to put the full, credential data in the clear on a blockchain. It's also expensive. We were doing what is still commonly used, creating hashes and then adding those to Merkle trees, sort of a bunch of hashes of educational credentials, putting that on a blockchain. And that lets you, prove that the credential hasn't been tampered with, that it was issued at a certain point of time by a certain key. Over time, what we were doing basically predated GDPR, and a lot of discussion around, the right to erasure that complicates some aspects with, PII and blockchain, and even what is it called, like identifiable or correlatable data. So over time, a lot of us have moved to say, well, the identifiers, it can be helpful to have those anchored on a blockchain. We try to keep all personal data off chain as a best practice. Blockchain isn't necessarily needed, but a lot of times I do see people kind of trying to bend over backwards, reinvent the wheel to reinvent characteristics that blockchain provides for free, as by design and more securely. So, so it can be a critical piece of decentralized identity.
It seems like a natural fit. There was
Yeah.
a project that I worked on where we were working on medical imaging, and we had the same kind of concerns, like putting the actual medical data on chain. No way, we didn't want to do that. You also don't want to put it on there encrypted. This idea that you would hash something and be able to prove that to somebody else you're presenting the right data, because they can look at the data that you've given them and they can go check for a hash on the blockchain. And this just seems like such a natural fit for the way blockchains work and being able to prove data integrity. I mean, that's just hand in hand.
Well, even hashes can be considered identifiable or correlatable data under GDPR, so that's where it gets really complicated. Um, but there's ways to reconcile it through, dealing more with the decentralized identifiers and things like that, keeping those referenced on chain, but all the personal data off of it. And then, of course, there's been a lot of progress in the meantime with ZKPs. And so the architectures have gotten a little more, nuanced, but there's still a role in blockchain, especially for individuals in terms of the discoverability, availability. that blockchain can provide.
So one of the concepts related to decentralized identity is having a self-sovereign identity. And when I think about sovereignty, especially in a system where we're talking about either identity or in the medical space, this is where the individual has more control over their data or their identity. So is self-sovereign identity a subset? Are we looking like a Venn diagram where you have decentralized identity and then within inside of that it's self-sovereign, or is it some sort of an intersection, and how do they relate to each other?
That's a good question. They are, at some point, I would have considered them synonymous, and I'll tell you sort of how it went. So when I first got involved in this space, we were generally using the term self-sovereign identity. I already had sort of challenges with the term because I thought it sounded too much like a cult, like the sovereign people movements, and all that kind of basically militia kind of stuff. And a few of us who were very maybe more practical, but still agreed with the principles of SSI as laid out by people like Christopher Allen and Drummond Reed. So we started trying to mellow it out by calling it decentralized identity. And I think that was actually a really bad idea in retrospect, because now I think decentralized identity has just been so watered down. I've actually gone back to using the term SSI because it is clearly aligned with the principles of SSI. So I just sort of hold my nose at any risk that it sounds like a cult or whatever. But the reason I use it is because that is aligned in those principles that I can link to in the chat, but basically where people are meaningfully involved and have control over their digital identity, notions of consent and things like that, with a lot of what gets referred to as decentralized identity tech. We see a lot of anti-patterns, not at all anchored in these principles around individual control, essentially giving, equal, if not more, power to the organization's ability to surveil people, et cetera. So that's a little just the notion of history. I'm going back to calling it SSI, basically.
It's interesting that you have arrived at this conflict over the word sovereign. Grant and I talk a lot about that here on FOMO. At one point in my life, and I was raised in a libertarian household where sovereign was wielded right next to liberty and freedom. But at some point in my life, I thought sovereign, or I had an epiphany that sovereign was something that you give to your neighbor rather than take for yourself, because inherent in the concept of sovereignty is some sort of irony. Because when we have identity, and identity is really at the core for anyone who goes down this path of how we are to operate in the world, identity is so crucial. But it takes two parties for this to even be an issue at hand. So it's interesting that you went towards decentralization and came back to sovereignty. I had so much the same path.
Yeah, it is really interesting that it sort of allowed me to maybe redefine it without the baggage that, for whatever reason, I had held with it before. So that's a really good characterization.
So there's a way to think about identities, decentralized identities, like a way to say they're doing some things right, they're doing some things maybe not so right. Is there a way for us to reason about or evaluate different ones? Because I think that there are quite a few. World ID, that somebody did one on Polygon as well. Like I've seen quite a few of these out there in the world. We haven't seen a widespread adoption. I'd say that there have been experiments and things that have happened, but it's not like we're all walking around with a decentralized identity yet. So is there a reason for that, or have you guys developed a way to reason about decentralized identity, to think about it, to give them a score or a grade?
That's a good point. I think that we have approached it more along the lines of, um, what are the harms and risks for different parts of the stack? So of the technical stack, for example, we're doing this in things like our did methods working group, talking about the different sorts of characteristics that, how does it help you avoid being correlated across providers, things like that. Um, and I think there have been a lot of efforts, sort of more broadly, not specific to decentralized identity. One collaboration we did with the Ethereum Foundation, Privacy and Scaling Explorations, did try to, and it ends up getting very subjective, but basically um, try to come up with some evaluation against Christopher Allen's principles of self-sovereign identity. And, it was sort of like the grades or scores we would give felt sometimes a little bit challenging, but with the detailed justifications, at least you could have a discussion or argument about what it meant. And actually, I'm sorry, I don't have a reference to that one. I'll see if I can get it afterwards.
Well, this
But,
chart kind of reminds me of those
yeah,
big charts where like you want to be the one that has the check on all the columns with it. I think on some of these, there are actually things on here that you say, well, some of these might be somewhat undesirable things. Is that an accurate way to say some of these are less desirable than others?
that's right. And that's really one of the interesting challenges. So now so like the I think there's more of a need for what we were just talking about, which is the idea of what makes a good decentralized identity, characteristics at the system level. This is an example of something that we've done, jumping down to a specific standard in DID methods. And what's interesting about DIDs, so, well, we'll get into what those are, but this one shows the trade-offs that can be made. Some types of DIDs or decentralized identifiers are better for people, some are better for organizations, and they have tons of trade-offs. So this is an example of one of these that sort of like, it can be a challenge to say this is a good solution, with all the nuances that's involved in defining that. So to some extent, it's top down and bottom up. And this is an example of a bottom up that tries to be more objective, but lets people choose according to specific traits or criteria. And we'll probably get more into what these mean and what they're trying to get at.
It's pretty funny. Then when I first started telling people I was looking to create a new DID method, what I heard frequently was that there was already over 200 different DID methods, and so a lot of people said, "Why on earth would you do that?" The other thing I heard was, and then I found out later that the number is actually closer to 250. People have been trying to do this for a very long time, and it's really, as we'll talk about some of these things, but it's getting to Christopher Allen's original like 10 principles of self-sovereign identity. Joe Andreu added another 3 with a bunch of bullets. It's getting to those concepts of self-sovereignty and privacy is actually just a really tough thing to do. And I personally am really big into the idea that you might own your identity and that you might be able to be free from all of the the platforms that control different facets of our identity, so that you can actually have like an identity you carry around the world. Yeah, there you go. Yes, that is. Um, Christopher Allen published this, I believe, in 2017. The original 10 principles. Is that right, Kim? 2017? Does that sound about right?
I thought it's like 1 or 2 years earlier, but I'll dig it up from his site.
Yeah.
This is almost concurrent with the time that Ethereum is just coming out. So definitely we've got the world of blockchains firmly entrenched at this point.
hmm
Yeah.
And it's really the sort of thing that if you think about identity in like the real world, right? You are a person. The sort of the identity is an obvious thing. I am a physical flesh and blood person, and therefore I have an identity because you can look at me and say, "Hey, there's Ken," and I can tell you I'm Ken Griggs, right? And then I can show you my passport. Look, the government says I'm Ken Griggs. And oh, okay, now I know this statement about this person standing in front of me made by a trusted authority, right? And that's where you get to this notion of credentials. But all of that kind of breaks down online, which is how we kind of got to self-sovereign identity, and uh, which is what it is I was hoping to add to in the world.
And really, what we're talking about when we're saying what can you do online, we're starting to have this concept of decentralized trust. You said the word trust, Ken. So trust to me is, how do I make a statement about myself in a way that you can actually trust it? I could say that I'm, a young woman living in Texas and I'm 30 years old, but if I can't prove that to you, then you may be suspect that you're actually talking to a woman who's 30 years old and lives in Austin, Texas, unless she can some way prove that. And as you've mentioned, or as we're all aware, the typical way to do this, and the way that you do it at the bar, is to flash your government ID, and then they see all kinds of stuff that isn't appropriate for proving identity, and maybe first name and the place that you currently live, but not your full residential address. So we haven't really had a mechanism to do decentralized trust on the internet, and it's led to some of the woes that we have now, where people don't know that they're talking to AI, they don't know that they're talking to somebody who they're not, and we really don't have any way to reconcile this until we have a self-sovereign identity. Is that the solution for all of these problems?
Well, the way I would see it is, so the risk that I hear often, and that's not what you were saying, but just to get people's minds on it. So a lot of people say the original harm or sin, is to Kim Cameron's point about the internet was built without an identity layer. And so you'll hear many people saying, we're building the internet identity layer. And I think the most important part of good self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity, what is that it's contextual, that it's not necessarily this blanket identity. The real harm that we see, a risk that we see coming in front of us, is that now that MDLs, mobile driver's license, for example, are rolling out, available in online form, that people will just go ahead and use that. And there are, not just the sort of more egregious issues like phone home, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point, all kinds of ability to track and correlate behavior, which could have a chilling effect on free speech. So in a way, it's really good that the internet was designed without an identity layer. I think, there are things we could have done early on to make what we're trying to do in decentralized identity and SSI easier, along sort of the ability to establish and carry through trust. But in my mind, this sort of making sure that there are there's the context awareness as we build identity layers.
Okay, well, we might want to sort of get into what those pieces are. So I think it's worth starting with what is DID. I think we've thrown that acronym around a couple of times, and DID methods. So a DID is a decentralized identifier. It is a way to directly identify a thing, and then a DID method is sort of the larger way of resolving a decentralized identifier, a DID, into, in the first place, what is called a DID document, which can then contain some descriptive information about that DID. But then that DID method, or that decentralized identifier, also then becomes something that we can make statements about. And so now we have, the notion of a credential, that has an issuer. Here's somebody who's making a statement, the statement being made, and then a subject who this statement is being made about. And we call those verifiable credentials when
Wait a
there's
minute. Give us an example of that. So you kind of said a bunch of things, but
I did.
Well, I mean, you said you've got a did and you can make a statement, but like, give us something concrete. Is it more like
Can
what I
I-
said? Like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in with that because yeah, I think it is helpful to be very tangible about this. So yes, like let's go back to the case of a course certificate. So this is the problem we're trying to solve in block search. So say that you have the course certificate. It might say Kim Duffy got the certificate. There are a lot of Kim Duffys in the world. So how does the relying party or recipient that I'm trying to share it with, how do they know it's me? So, there's name, that's weak. It's not very specific. Email address could be, for example, if it's tied to your education provider, it's not necessarily permanent. You may lose access. Now, the way that many of us started to move to was cryptographic binding, the ability to sign a statement. So if you embed some sort of cryptographic identifier in that credential, and I control that identifier, I can sign a separate statement, and that's me, the same person who, or same sign-in key, basically. So that's where we started. Basically, it was like, okay, issue the credential, add a public key in there. But a good cryptographic practice is to rotate your keys. So how do you solve that? Do you have to go ask the issuer every time you rotate your key to reissue you a credential? So that's how I stumbled onto DIDs, which was a DID is this string that allows you to update keys, add other information about, like Ken was talking about in this DID document. You can say, here are all the keys I'll allow for signing. These are secure channels you can reach me at, etc. So that's the role of DID. So instead of putting that public key in the credential, you could put a DID in there. And then there's all these ways to establish, yes, that's Kim.
So Ken,
Mhm.
does that resonate? Because like what I was trying to get at, and I think Kim made it pretty concrete there, is that there's the actual identity itself. Like, how do we know we're talking about the correct person, and then we're making a statement or we're trying to assert something about that person? That's why I was falling to that. Well, I'm a person who's living in Texas and I have a certain age. Those are all credential type things, or those are
Right.
statements about the subject itself. This is the
Exactly.
identity. Yeah.
Right. So an identity can be anything. It can, the identifier is for any unique thing in the world. It can be your dog. It becomes an identity when we start collecting some statements about ourselves. So the typical ones being government statements about a person. So this, or even my parents have given me this name, and then, by the way, we recorded it with the government, and the government certifies that this is my name. Now it becomes an identity that I can carry around. That identity may have the ability to sign its own statements, right? Just as you would sign a document with a pen. That identity, you might want to present it just to prove who you are, to prove you're over 18 or what have you. And so there's a lot of data and functionality that come along with an identity that sort of as distinct from the identifier itself. But so this is where we start getting into, okay, if I have this identity, what does this what are the aspects about how this identity works? And I apologize if you hear that noise in the background. And so that's sort of where we get to this comparison of DID methods, and we talk about update supported. So can you create an update to record a new key, like Kim had said? Well, DID key, the identifier is literally the the key, and so you can't update it without having a new identifier. And so any statements made about that identifier no longer apply when you try to change your key. So it's that kind of that kind of brings home the distinction. If you're using just the raw key, you can't update it. As Kim said, any credentials, any statements made about that identifier would then be invalidated if the person was trying to use a different identity using a did key. So and what we have here is a collection of different ways to think about did methods that were put together by this working group and just released, and they just hit 1.0, I think, like 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. There's a lot of things, especially at the end, that get really, really specific about implementation details. But there's also a lot of things here that are really useful. There's a few of them I want to call out, and I think we have a different view of this that I think might be useful, because as you mentioned, some of them are actually negative, whereas most of these are positive. And so that we can think about how do we decide which did methods are appropriate in which applications.
Yep, exactly. And that's the important thing. Some of these, they're not necessarily value judgments, some of them. They're a way to reason about them. So things like, do they support update, rotation, things like that. It's not just the sort of enumeration of traits, but that spec also defines a JSON schema for expressing an individual did methods evaluation according to those. So you can inspect them, figure out, dynamically all of these characteristics.
Right, and as I have just released the NotBot, which is essentially a did method. The proper name for it is did Julia. So I've added a column here. I would like to sort of talk about, if I may, the did Julia did method, and sort of how it is that sort of fits in terms of, when we thinking about self-sovereign identity. So just real quick, things like update supported. That's what Kim had mentioned, the idea that you can update your keys and the identity is still the same. The service endpoints, that's when we say service endpoints, those are just things in your did document. Can you update your did document? Yes, you can. Deactivate, can you deactivate one? I highlighted in red here a few that I think are actually negative. So deleting an identity or an identifier, I think of that as being a bad thing. I'd marked it red here. Because it's permanent, right? An identity once deleted, if it was deleted in error or any of these other things, that becomes, that could be a pretty catastrophic loss for someone. We also then have to wonder who has the authority to delete something. And I call this out here because did Julia, it's not actually possible to do a delete. You can deactivate, but you cannot delete. I want to step through a few others because it's sort of a long list, and I don't want to hit all of them. I'll be happy to discuss in other forums what all of these things are in detail if you'd like. But another one that has turned out to be really valuable is a notion is to think about recovery. What happens when you lose the key, as people will do if the key is embedded in your phone and you drop your phone overboard while you're out on a boat, or what have you. What happens when you lose your key? One of the things that we have is this notion of being able to recover by pre-committing to another key, whether that be in some kind of a physical token, or whether that be a key that you have recorded on a piece of paper or on some other way, that you can just sort of immediately by yourself take this thing that you have protected for a rainy day and instantly do your recovery on your own. That's a really valuable thing, that is sort of it's a new concept in this identity space that Julia does support. Another one I want to talk about is multi-sig, right? This idea that that there's more than one key that owns an identity. If you think in terms of not just people, but in terms of organizations, right? If even something as big as like the U.S. government, if the U.S. government had an identity that it could use to assert different statements as the government, you would want to lock that down better than just having one key. And if that one key got away, if that one key, someone, maliciously, had the opportunity to use it in some way to do damage, that would be dangerous, right? So instead, for those high value kinds of identities, it's really important to be able to have what we call a multi-sig, a multiple signature, where you require the holders of different keys to all agree that, hey, we want to take this action using this identity. And in fact, for Julia.Social, we also have a notion of a multi-class digital identity, where you have you may have 2 of 3 of one class of people that have to sign, and 2 of 3 of another.
For multi-sig, is this really for like institutions or for companies? Is this where you have really the identity as the aggregate of a collection of individuals acting in tandem, or do you view that there are multi-sigs that we'd more think about at the individual level, like, I don't know, some high profile person like Britney Spears or something like that?
So there's a lot of answers to that. One, of course, is, as you said, the idea of having an organization might want to protect their digital identity by requiring this multi-sig ceremony. But another thing you can do with multi-sig is make it so that a less trusted person can't sign something on their own. Whether it's a child who wants to do a thing, but then the parent has to sign off too, or almost similarly, an AI agent wants to do a thing, but the parent has to sign off too. So you sort of have both of those applications for a multi-sig.
Got it.
The next thing about DIDs is that they often wind up with long strings of hex numbers, and that's appropriate for hiding, for making sure that you're capable of hiding information, right? So it's a hash or a key or some other thing that properly protects the privacy of the holder of that identity. But that makes them also really difficult to distinguish for humans. Humans typically may read the first few characters or the last few characters of a long string like that, and that's about it. So having a way to attach a proper human readable name is tremendously valuable. So within Julia.Social, we have this notion of Julia verified, vanity names, and which we can currently reserve a Julia vanity name using the reserve name system in place. At that point, it becomes did Julia Fizpawiz, which is a name I often use online, and it becomes very easy to read. So that's a really valuable thing that I think is a differentiator for Julia that I'd like to call out.
Lucas, what comes to your mind at this point? You've heard a lot about decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity, DID methods. What are you thinking right now? Help me out.
Well, I was actually wondering, to throw it back to Kim, you're part of an organization that has seen a great deal of interest with technical solutions towards self-sovereign or decentralized identities, and I think that it is both hard for users of the internet, people who are engaging in a digital world. It's not something that's readily apparent to them. And Kim, earlier you said that we live currently in a world where this this identity has been siloed into service providers. So when you think about where success comes for this, for self-sovereign identities to be understood and used by everybody who's entering into this digital space, have you thought about how that occurs and what some of the roadblocks have been?
Yeah, I think in general in the identity space, the biggest challenge has been that we have been too navel gazing and focused on this vague problem called identity, independent of specific use cases. And where we've been increasingly focused is combining, allying with other communities. One that I'm really excited about is the local first community. So it's interesting that there's quite a few in the Web3 communities, which is interesting because especially over the last, well, since GDPR and a lot of the momentum that you would see in quote unquote decentralized identity projects, some of them have moved totally off chain, but we found that a lot of Web3 blockchain focused partners are more committed to these goals of self-sovereignty, the original goals that we hold to. And then also, like I said, other communities like Local First, et cetera. There's some people focusing on building identities, secure delegation chains around AI agents. And so what's really interesting is that the outreach and working together to maybe address more concrete use cases is where we're finding the most productivity and I would say joy, because it is ultimately, since DIF is an engineering organization, we really like to sort of see progress happening and rolling out in the world. Of the many efforts we have going, one of those is called Diff Labs. And that's one venue where we try to bring in different communities to build projects based on this technology.
I wonder if we're almost at a point in the world where the world is crying for what's needed in this space. If you think about YouTube just rolled out age verification requirements, and in the UK we've got age requirements for certain types of restricted behaviors on the internet. Having to present your full credentials, having to show your ID, and then having to have the site be responsible for either the ingestion of that PII, the validation of that PII, and maybe even the storage of it seems incredibly risky for everybody. This
Exactly.
this technology seems like it's ready to revolutionize the world, especially given the problems that we've got on the internet right now. I mean, are we on the cusp of, hey, the world needs the painkiller, and Diff and Julia are just been ready to provide it, but everybody needed to have a problem that needed to be solved, and now I guess the government has stepped in and said you do, and YouTube has said, all right, well then we'll put those checks in place.
Well, Ken, you were highlighting some of the novel attributes of Julia and your NotBot application. One in you can't lose your identity, or it can't be permanently deleted. Also, that it's locally resolvable. What have you thought about as you were tackling this issue, this nebulous concept that people are actually aching for? You've obviously thought about some of the things that were missing in the tools that we use to access it. You've presented too. Could you just speak more broadly to what you saw as the problems and the barriers to more use of decentralized identities?
Well, so wow, so that's a huge one. So the biggest problem around decentralized identity, honestly, has been adoption. Getting, it hasn't been a technological one. We have had, good technologies for decentralized identity, for what we call selective disclosure, only sharing the information that you want to share. We've had good technologies for that for a long time. The getting adoption, giving people a really good reason to use a decentralized identity, and then giving them a really good way to use a decentralized identity has been the things that I've been focused on. The other one that I've been focused on is privacy. When you look at the internet today, privacy is rapidly eroding. We've all become numb, honestly, to the number of breaches and leaks of personal information that seem to be happening all of the time, and just the amount of data that is being held by and the number of people who are holding it is terrifying. So these are the things that I was focused on. Starting with privacy, I wanted to make sure if I was going to create a decentralized identity platform or any kind of an identity platform, I didn't want to have any data, right? Data, information is control, right? If I know who the people are that are using my identity system, then I can, I could, in theory, if I was not me, if there was some other CEO in my seat, do something with that, which might have negative consequences for the people who use and hold those identities. And so, that was a really, really key thing for me, is that I should not know anything at all about the people who use my identities. And that includes not knowing where they use those identities, when they use them, just entirely not being involved in that process. The other thing, and sort of the basis of NotBot, is what people need a reason to use it, we've hit this space now where you have people who are creating real content that looks like other people, there's bot driven accounts on social media that act on that platform like a real person. Very difficult to distinguish. So having some way to, we now have a reason that we need to use a digital identity. And then the other thing is, finding a way to enable people to use it, right? So if we stop and say, okay, internet, everybody needs to pick up this new standard for identifying people, and every single website out there all needs to have some new standard for identifying people, and they all need to adopt this technological change at once. That's not going to happen, or if it does, it's going to happen over the course of a lot of years. And but AI is here, and the bots are here now, and we've all this all started in November of 2022 with the original Chat GPT, and it's going, whether you think it's going exponential or tapering off or whatever, the rate of advancement in this space is incredible. And so we need something that we can use now. So those are the things I was really thinking about, is to ensure privacy, and to make sure that people have something that they can use right now.
Kim, go ahead.
No, does that make sense? Is there
yeah. Absolutely.
Kim, you had another thought on the discussion that happened just previous to this. What else were you thinking along those lines?
Yeah, so you were mentioning the point that the time seems to be now for decentralized identity and SSI, and that is exactly right. I think to some extent the overreach of the mobile driver's license spec, specifically the server retrieval functionality that would phone home, when many of us, including the ACLU, found out that remained in the spec. And in fact, when Utah found out that they had rolled out a solution to prefer this phone home functionality, which would call the government servers on your every use of the MDL, there was such backlash. And there's a lot of leadership, in fact, now coming from the state of Utah. They're proposing this state-endorsed digital identity method and pushing this and advocating it with other states, which totally shifts the role. So people show up with their identities, and the state's role is to endorse it, but not to give it to you. And so there's a lot of now momentum coming from it. I'm not sure we would have seen it unless there was this extreme overreach that had happened. So, I guess the pendulum is swinging, and I think the time is really good, and the right sort of people are behind it now.
Well, that might be the place where we have to close this. I think there is, the opportunity in the world for the right solution. The world is waiting for it, and we've seen a variety of things that have come, gone, and still exist that seem to have some amount of problems. I remember looking at World ID recently, and I saw that they were kind of going this way of embracing crypto and creating this weird ecosystem instead of focusing on the core identity. How do we do decentralized trust? We'll have to see which player really arises that can solve the world's problems. But it seems like you and I at least have an accord that we're now faced with a problem that it seems that a self-sovereign identity could solve. There's multiple different fronts where this battle is happening and where this solution needs to come to play. And hopefully in short order, we'll be talking about that identity which gains some adoption, and where we start to see people presenting credentials, presenting identity, doing so in a decentralized way that has a lot of these goodnesses that we've got in the chart here. And that, as we start to think about the one that we love, the one that we like, everybody will start using it. And that's all the time we've got on FOMO, and we'll see you next time.